Welcome to Quiet Battles, Loud Grace, where hidden wounds meet relentless grace. We have real conversations about faith, burnout, trauma, leadership, and what it means to be human. No fake perfection, no polished answers, just honest conversations and relentless grace. Because sometimes the people helping everyone else are the ones quietly struggling the most.
Well, hey, everybody. I am Brent Dyer. And before we go any further, I just want to say thank you for being here. Whether you're listening on your morning commute or sitting in a parking lot, avoiding going inside Target or walking the dog or lying awake at 2 a.m. in the morning or really just trying to survive another difficult season, I'm grateful you're here because this podcast is for people who are carrying things that nobody knows about. Things they've hidden, things they've survived, things they're still trying to survive. It's for people who are carrying quiet battles. And if that's you, I want you to know something right from the very beginning, from this very first episode. You are not alone, and your story is not over. For most of my life, I thought strength meant keeping it all together. You see, I grew up in a pastor's home. Church wasn't just something we attended. Church was our world. Sunday mornings, Sunday nights, Wednesday nights, vacation Bible school, revival services, choir practice, RAs, GAs, committee meetings, potlucks. I mean, if the church doors were open, we were there. I was literally there like the week I was born or like all my life I've been a part of the church, and I loved the church. I still do love the church, capital C. And eventually I followed the same path. I went into ministry, and for 25 years, I served as a worship pastor. I led worship. I built teams. I produced services. I traveled. I spoke places. I was in churches. My very first church ran 150 people. My very last church had 15,000 members. So I've done all of it. I've seen it all. I've created experiences and poured my life into helping people encounter God. And honestly, I loved most of it. It wasn't just what I did, it was who I was. And that was part of the problem. My identity became intertwined with my calling, my title, my role, my position, my purpose, or at least I thought what my purpose was. And that's where my story begins. Because sometimes the thing we build our entire identity around becomes the very thing God has to pry loose from our hands. Not because he's cruel, but because he's kind. A few years ago, my life began to unravel. Not all at once. Most unraveling doesn't happen all at once. It's usually slower than that, and so it was with me. A disappointment here, a loss there, questions, doubts, heartbreak, fatigue, pressure, fear, the kind of struggles that don't show up on a social media highlight reel, right? The kind of pain that people carry behind the scenes. For me, it was the kind of battle that nobody sees. And then one day something happened I never expected. My ministry career just ended, just like that. There one day, gone the next. The thing that I had spent 25 years building my life on was gone. And suddenly I wasn't just grieving a job. I was grieving an identity. I was grieving a future. I was grieving a version of myself that I thought was the real version. And for 25 years, I thought I knew exactly who I was. I was a worship pastor. I knew where I belonged. I knew where my future was headed. I knew what the future looked like. I knew what next year looked like. I knew what 10 years from now looked like. Or at least I thought I did, right? Then one day it all just disappeared overnight. And what I discovered in the months that followed is that grief isn't just about losing people. It's not just when someone passes, but grief is about losing a version of yourself. It can be about losing a version of yourself. And sometimes it's about losing an identity that you've carried for so long, you cannot remember who you were before it. Sometimes it's waking up one morning and realizing the story you thought you were living is no longer the story you're in. Sometimes it's about burying a dream that never got a funeral. And nobody sends flowers for that kind of loss. Nobody brings casseroles. Nobody gathers around and acknowledges that something awesome or precious has died, but the pain is still real. And for a season, I found myself grieving not only what I had experienced and what had happened, but what I thought was going to happen. I was grieving a future that would never come, a future that would never arrive. I was grieving a role that had become an identity. I was grieving a version of Brent that no longer existed. And if you've ever walked through the collapse of a marriage, the loss of a career, a shattered dream, a shattered ministry dream, a business failure, a betrayal, a diagnosis, or some sort of season that changed everything, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know what it feels like to stand in the rubble of a life you never imagined losing and wonder, who am I now? Who am I now? I mean, there were some expletives in there when I first realized what was going on. It wasn't quite that simple and it wasn't quite that clean. It was messy and dirty and hard. And it was the hardest thing I've probably ever walked through. And looking back, I can see that God wasn't destroying my life. He was uncovering it. He wasn't taking away my identity. He was separating my identity from the roles that I had played, from the titles that I had spent years attaching it to. And at the time, it felt like an ending. But looking back now, I see that it was the beginning of a very different story. That season eventually became the foundation for a book I wrote called The Beautiful Undoing. And the title came from something I began to realize in my own pain. It's sometimes God does his deepest work through dismantling. I'm going to say that again. Sometimes God does his deepest work through dismantling, not because he enjoys our suffering or because he wants to hurt us, but because sometimes the life we've built becomes too small for the life he's trying to give us. Louder for those in the back. Sometimes the life we've built becomes too small for the life he wants to give us. The things we cling to become the things that keep us stuck. And sometimes before God can rebuild us, he has to lovingly undo us. And that's that is terrifying when you're living in it, when you're in the middle of it. But it's beautiful when you look back on it, not because the pain wasn't real, but because it wasn't wasted. Uh, during that season of my life, I found myself sitting with questions that I had helped other people answer. As a counselor, as a pastor, I've sat across from hundreds of people, heard hundreds of stories of trauma, addiction, grief, anxiety, depression, church hurt, um, marriage struggles, identity crisis, and one thing has become painfully obvious, that most people are carrying way more than anyone knows. The strongest looking people often have the deepest wounds, and that the happiest people sometimes have the heaviest burdens. The leaders everyone admires often feel desperately alone. Ask me how I know. The people helping everyone else are often the ones suffering in silence. And that's where the idea for this podcast began. I wanted to create a space where people could tell the truth, not polished stories, not church answers, not social media answers, but real stories of real pain, of real loss, of real healing, of, of resilience, of grace, all by real people, by ordinary people. Because healing begins when honesty begins. Uh, Clinically, now that I'm a therapist, I know something important. We know something important, that what stays unprocessed stays powerful. What remains unprocessed remains powerful. The wounds we ignore don't just disappear; they simply go underground. The emotions we suppress don't vanish; they show up somewhere else. Our bodies keep the score. Our nervous systems remember. And healing starts when we stop pretending we're okay and we begin telling the truth. Not because talking solves everything, but because hiding solves nothing. That conviction eventually led to something called the Backstage Project. So the Backstage Project was sort of birthed out of my own experience and the stories of so many other ministry leaders that I talk to, creatives that I work with, helping professionals. Here's what I discovered. Everybody sees what happens on stage, but very few people see what happens backstage. They see the sermon. They don't see the panic attack before the sermon. They see the worship service, but they don't see the exhaustion afterward. They see the success, but they don't see the depression. They see the smile, but they don't see the tears. They see the platform, but they don't see the pain. And yet, the backstage is where the real story lives, because that's where real life is, and that's the truth. That's the reality. And the Backstage Project it exists to help people who spend their lives helping others. So pastors, ministry leaders, creatives, counselors, nonprofit leaders, people who feel like they have to be strong all the time, people who are secretly wondering if they're allowed to fall apart, people who need space to heal, not because they're weak, but because they're human. And honestly, that's what the podcast is about too. That's what Quiet Battles, Loud Grace is about. It's about humanity. It's about being real, not perfection, not pretending. There will absolutely be some clinical elements because I'm a counselor. I love psychology. I love understanding trauma and grief and attachment and anxiety and relationships and resilience and all the things. We'll talk about all that. But this isn't primarily a mental health podcast. It's a story podcast. It's a hope podcast. It's a grace podcast, because every guest you'll hear this season has carried something difficult. Some have carried unimaginable loss. Some have walked through chronic illness. Some have experienced church hurt. Some have battled depression, faced addiction. Some have buried dreams and lost all hope. But every one of them has discovered something on the other side. Not easy answers, not cliches, not Christianese, not toxic positivity, but grace. Relentless grace. Unexpected grace. Grace that shows up in hospital rooms. Grace that sat with them in grief. Grace that carried them through trauma. And grace that refused to let suffering have the final word. And maybe that's why I think that's why I chose the name Quiet Battles, Loud Grace, because the battles are often quiet and most people don't see them. Most people don't know. I grew up with a quiet battle, literally for 36 years. No one knew what was going on in me. And I'll tell you more of my story at some point in this podcast season. But most people don't know about the battles. But grace, you see, grace is louder. Not always immediately, not always dramatically, not in the ways that we would want or expect, but eventually grace speaks. It speaks through healing, through friendship, through counseling, through faith, through courage, through survival, through hope. And sometimes it speaks through simply just making it through to another day. So as I close out this first episode, I want to speak directly to the person who feels alone. Maybe you're the pastor wondering if you can keep going. Maybe it's a ministry leader who's feeling exhausted, or the counselor, the therapist who's carrying everyone else's pain. Maybe you're a business owner trying to hold it all together. I'm that as well. I hear that. Maybe you're the parent who feels overwhelmed, or the person who's quietly battling anxiety, or maybe you're grieving something nobody else understands. Maybe you're wondering whether things will ever get better. Well, I want you to hear me. Your pain is real. Your struggle matters. Your story is important. And just because you're carrying it quietly doesn't mean you're carrying it alone. One of the greatest lies suffering tells us is that we're isolated, that nobody understands and that nobody would care, that we're the exception. But I'm here to tell you, we're not. We are human. And being human means we all need grace. And the good news is that grace has a way of finding us even when we've stopped looking for it. I have seen that in my own life. I've seen that in the lives of my clients. I've seen that in the stories that you'll hear on this podcast. And maybe if you stick around, you'll begin to see it in your own story too. So thanks for listening. Thank you for being here. Thank you for allowing me to share a small part of my journey. This is Quiet Battles, Loud Grace, where hidden wounds meet relentless grace. I'm Brent Dyer, and until next time, remember this. You may be fighting a quiet battle, but grace is louder.
Thanks for listening to Quiet Battles, Loud Grace. Quiet Battles is sponsored by the Backstage Project, a nonprofit organization providing hope, support, and resources for ministry leaders, creatives, and others navigating life's difficult seasons. To learn more, get involved, or support the mission, visit thebackstageproject.org. Until then, may you find strength for today's battle and grace for tomorrow's.